Las Vegas, August 15, 1972, carried a particular kind of heat that evening, one that clung to skin and nerves alike. The neon lights along the strip shimmered like restless spirits, reflecting off polished chrome, sequined dresses, and the glossy windows of limousines that never truly slept. Inside the Sands Hotel, however, the air was cool, measured, and carefully controlled, just like the city's most powerful people preferred it. Tucked beside the legendary Copa Room, in a discreet VIP alcove shielded by soft lighting and thick velvet curtains, Dean Martin sat at a long, immaculately set table with his family. The noise of the casino floor faded into a distant murmur here, replaced by the gentle clink of silverware and the low hum of conversation. This was not a public appearance, not a performance, not a contract obligation. This was family. Dean rarely allowed himself moments like this anymore. Years of fame had taught him caution, how every smile could be misread, every gathering interrupted. But tonight was different. Tonight was sacred. Across from him sat his daughter, Diana. She was 18 now, no longer the little girl who once waited backstage for him with coloring books and wide-eyed wonder. She wore a pale pink chiffon dress that moved like air when she shifted in her seat, a simple pearl necklace resting against her collarbone. Her long blonde hair fell naturally over her shoulders, catching the warm light. There was no vanity in her beauty, only innocence, intelligence, and quiet confidence. Dean watched her the way fathers do, when they know time is moving faster than they'd like. Diana had just finished her first year at university, excelling beyond every expectation. She spoke gently about Renaissance art, about Florence and Rome, about museums she dreamed of walking through not as a tourist but as a scholar. Her professors had written letters, real letters, not formal notes, praising her discipline, her curiosity, her mind. Dean listened with pride so intense it almost hurt. "You've done something right when your child surpasses you," he said softly, lifting his glass but not drinking. "Not in fame, in character." Diana smiled, embarrassed. "Dad, you make it sound so serious." "It is," he replied, eyes warm. "The world is loud, good character is quiet, that's how you know it's real." Jan, seated beside Diana, placed a hand over her daughter, sharing a look only mothers and daughters understand. For a brief, precious moment, the rest of the world did not exist. But Las Vegas never allows peace to last long. 3 tables away, a man had been watching. Vincent Russo was not subtle. He had never needed to be. At 45, his body still carried the density of someone who had grown up surviving first, thriving later. Thick forearms rested on the table, fingers heavy with gold rings. His eyes, half-lidded, calculating, moved slowly, deliberately, as if ownership began with observation. Russo had power the way storms do, not admired, endured. He was known throughout the city not by reputation alone, but by absence, people who had once been seen and were no longer there. Casinos tolerated him because they feared him. Politicians shook his hand because they needed him. Staff avoided eye contact because survival depended on it. And tonight, his gaze had landed where it did not belong. Diana laughed at something her father said, a light, unguarded sound. Russo's eyes followed the movement of her head, her hands, the way she leaned forward. His thoughts were not polite. They were not decent. They were the kind that rot behind smiles. Dean did not notice at first. He was too busy being a father. The waiter arrived with dessert, placing it gently before Diana. Dean leaned back slightly, satisfied, content. It was in that moment, when peace was at its most fragile, that Russo stood. The scrape of his chair against the floor cut through the room like a blade. Conversations at nearby tables slowed. Waiters paused mid-step. The atmosphere shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. People recognized danger the way animals do instinctively. Russo walked toward Dean's table with deliberate confidence, each step heavy, claiming space. When he spoke, his voice was thick, casual, and entirely unwelcome. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, smiling without warmth. "Dean Martin himself didn't expect to see you dining like a regular man." Dean looked up. He knew who Vincent Russo was. Everyone did. And in that instant, a single thought crossed his mind, not fear, not anger, but calculation. "My family is here." He rose slowly from his seat, posture relaxed but alert. "Good evening, Vincent," he said evenly. "We're having a private family dinner." Russo chuckled, his eyes already drifting past Dean, landing on Diana. He did not hide it. "Family," he repeated, "that's your daughter." Diana stiffened. Jan's hand tightened protectively around her arm. Yes, Dean replied, his tone now noticeably colder. And this conversation is over. Russo ignored him. Well, he continued, eyes lingering far too long, she's grown into quite the woman. Not a child anymore, is she? The air seemed to vanish from the room. Nearby diners stared into their plates. No one spoke, no one moved. Diana's face flushed, confusion and discomfort flickering across her features. Jan pulled her closer, instinct overriding decorum. Dean did not raise his voice. That was what terrified people later when they told the story. He stepped forward once, just enough to reclaim the space Russo had invaded. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes hardened into something unmovable. "Vincent," he said quietly, every syllable deliberate, "you will leave this table now." Russo laughed, surprised. "You giving me orders, Singer?" Dean didn't blink. "I'm setting a boundary." Russo leaned in slightly, testing him. "And if I do?" Dean held his gaze, unflinching. "Then tonight becomes something you don't want it to be." For the first time, uncertainty crossed Russo's face. Not fear, but calculation of a different kind. Because Dean Martin was not threatening violence. He was threatening influence. And in Las Vegas, that was far more dangerous. The manager hovered nearby, sweating, paralyzed between power and prestige. Everyone in the room felt it, the shift, the line being drawn. Dean turned slightly, placing himself between Russo and his family without touching him, without shouting, without spectacle. "Just presence." "Let me be very clear," he said, his voice calm enough to freeze the room. "You will not speak about my daughter again, not here, not anywhere." Russo straightened, pride bristling. "You forget who runs this city." Dean's response came without hesitation. "No," he said, "you forget who this city listens to." Silence followed, thick, suffocating. And that was when everyone understood. This night was no longer about a bad joke. It was about respect. And respect, once challenged, demanded an answer. The silence after Dean Martin's words was not ordinary silence. It was the kind that presses against the ears, that makes people suddenly aware of their own breathing, the weight of their own bodies in chairs, the danger of being seen at the wrong moment. Forks hovered midair. Glasses remained untouched. Somewhere near the back of the room, a slot machine chimed faintly, an almost mocking reminder that Las Vegas never truly stopped, even when history paused. Vincent Russo did not move. For a man accustomed to obedience, the stillness felt unnatural. His entire life had been built on reaction, people stepping aside, lowering their gaze, offering nervous smiles or rushed apologies. Fear was usually immediate, automatic. But now, standing only a few feet from Dean Martin, he felt something different. Resistance. Not loud. Not aggressive. But immovable. Russo studied Dean's face, searching for cracks. He expected rage or panic or bravado. Instead, he found composure. The kind that came not from power borrowed, but power earned over decades, through loyalty, kindness, and a reputation that could not be bought or forced. "You're making a mistake," Russo finally said, lowering his voice so only Dean could hear. "Men who embarrass me don't stay comfortable in this city." Dean's expression did not change. "You've already embarrassed yourself," he replied calmly. "I'm simply deciding how much further you want to go." That was the moment the balance shifted. Russo felt it before he understood it. The room was no longer leaning toward him. The waitstaff, who once trembled at his presence, now stood frozen, watching Dean instead. Even the gamblers at nearby tables, men who had seen blood spilled over smaller insults, sensed that something irreversible was happening. Dean had not raised his hand. He had raised a line. Behind him, Diana sat silently, her heart pounding. She had never seen her father like this, not on stage, not in interviews, not in moments of public pressure. This was different. This was not Dean Martin, the entertainer. This was a father. Jan watched him too, fear and pride warring in her chest. She understood the risk. Everyone did. Vincent Russo was not a man you confronted lightly, but she also understood something else. Dean was not acting impulsively. This was not anger. This was principle. And principle, when tested publicly, demanded resolution. Russo glanced around again, this time more carefully. He noticed something he had missed before. At a table near the window sat a casino owner who had once begged Dean to extend a residency. At another sat a local councilman who owed his election victory to a fundraiser hosted by Dean years earlier. Near the bar stood a police lieutenant who had grown up listening to Dean's records, whose mother still kept his phone framed in her living room. These people did not fear Russo. They tolerated him, but they respected Dean. Russo's jaw tightened. "You think they'll protect you?" he muttered. "You think smiles and songs beat muscle?" Dean finally leaned in slightly, his voice still measured but now unmistakably dangerous. "I don't need protection," he said. "I need witnesses." The words landed like a blow. Because witnesses meant memory, and memory meant reputation. And reputation, once shattered, never returned whole. The restaurant manager, Marcel, broke under the pressure. He stepped forward, hands shaking, his voice barely steady. "Mr. Russo, perhaps we can arrange another table, a quieter area." Russo turned on him sharply. "You telling me to move?" Marcel swallowed hard, eyes flicking to Dean, then back. "I'm asking you for tonight." Russo laughed, but it sounded strained now, forced, the laughter of a man who sensed control slipping through his fingers. "For him," Russo scoffed, "you'd choose a singer over me." Dean answered before Marcel could. "You're not being chosen over," he said. "You're being removed." A ripple moved through the room. Russo's face flushed, not with rage alone, but with humiliation. No one had ever spoken to him like this in public, ever. "You forget," Russo snapped. "This city runs on fear." Dean shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "it survives on trust. Fear just borrows time." The words struck deeper than Russo expected. Because they were true. For years, Russo had forced loyalty. Dean had inspired it. And inspiration, Dean knew, endured long after fear burned itself out. Russo leaned closer, lowering his voice to a hiss. "This isn't over." Dean met his eyes without blinking. "For you, it is." There was something final in the way he said it. Not threatening, not dramatic. Final. Russo straightened. For a long moment, no one knew what he would do. Violence hovered like a shadow at the edge of the room. One wrong move, one raised voice, and the night could fracture into chaos. Instead, Russo took a step back. Just one. It was small, barely noticeable. But everyone saw it. The manager exhaled shakily. A waiter nearly dropped a tray. Diana felt her knees weaken. Russo looked around one last time, locking eyes with faces that no longer looked away. He understood now. If he stayed, he would lose more than pride. He would lose standing. "Enjoy your dinner," he muttered, the words sour. "This city's bigger than both of us." Dean did not respond. He simply turned his back. That more than anything sealed it. Russo left the restaurant without another word, his footsteps heavy, his entourage scrambling behind him. The door closed. The tension lingered like smoke. Then slowly, breath returned to the room. Applause did not come immediately. People were too stunned, too aware they had just witnessed something rare, something that could not be undone. Dean returned to his seat. He reached for Diana's hand. She was trembling. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said softly. She shook her head, eyes shining. "No, I'm glad I did." Jan squeezed his arm, unable to speak. Dinner resumed, but nothing tasted the same. Conversations were quieter, more reverent. Word was already spreading, whispered from table to table, waiter to waiter. Dean Martin had drawn a line that even the Mafia would not cross. And outside, under the glowing neon lights of Las Vegas, the city itself seemed to pause. As if recognizing that real power had just reminded fear of its limits. Las Vegas did not sleep that night. By dawn, the story had already changed shape, passed quietly from bartender to pit boss, from valet to casino executive, from hotel suite to city office. No headlines printed it. No police reports recorded it. But everyone who mattered knew exactly what had happened inside the sands. Vincent Russo had been made to leave. Not threatened with fists. Not humiliated with violence. But dismissed publicly, cleanly, and without apology. That was worse. Russo sat alone in a private room hours later, the air thick with cigarette smoke and wounded pride. His men stood along the walls, silent, uncertain. They had never seen their boss like this, not pacing, not brooding, not silent in that particular way that meant calculation rather than rage. For the first time in years, Russo had been measured and found lacking. The problem wasn't Dean Martin's words. The problem was that no one had challenged them. Russo replayed the scene again and again, the way the manager hesitated, the way the room leaned, not toward fear but toward respect, the way Dean had turned his back without checking whether Russo would react. That was the insult that lingered. Because fear demands attention. Respect doesn't ask for it. Russo finally broke the silence. "Find out who was in that room," he said quietly. "Every table, every face." One of his men hesitated. "Boss, a lot of them are." "I know who they are," Russo snapped. "That's the point." Across the city, Dean Martin woke to a very different morning. He sat at the breakfast table with Diana, sunlight filtering through the window. The previous night felt distant now, like a bad dream that left no physical mark, but changed something inside you permanently. Diana stirred her coffee, thoughtful. "Dad," she said softly, "were you afraid?" Dean paused. He considered the question honestly. "Yes," he said, "but not of him." She looked up. "I was afraid of the world you'd grow up in if I stayed quiet." That answer stayed with her. Dean knew the risks now. Russo was not the kind of man who forgot public humiliation. He did not seek revenge loudly. He waited. He pressured. He erased opportunities quietly. But Dean also knew something Russo did not. Fear works best in isolation. And Dean Martin was never alone. That afternoon, the Sands Hotel received 3 phone calls. The first came from a rival casino owner offering Dean an open-ended residency. No conditions, no expiration. The second came from a city official, just checking in, reminding the hotel how important Dean's presence was to Las Vegas tourism. The third came from a man who had once been rumored to work with Russo. His message was brief. "Some lines don't get crossed. You were right to draw yours." Russo, meanwhile, began to feel the shift. A scheduled private game was postponed indefinitely. A planned meeting quietly dissolved. A supplier suddenly became unavailable. Nothing dramatic, nothing traceable. Just absence. That was when Russo understood the deeper damage. Fear controls movement. Respect controls access. By the third day, even his own men sensed it. Conversations stopped when Russo entered rooms, not out of fear but uncertainty. The city was adjusting, recalibrating. Power was being quietly reassigned. Russo slammed his fist against the table. "He embarrassed me," he snarled. A singer. One of his older associates, someone who had survived long enough to know when to speak, cleared his throat carefully. "He didn't embarrass you," the man said. "You embarrassed yourself." Russo froze. "That family," the man continued cautiously, "they're off limits now, everyone knows it." Russo turned slowly. "Says who?" The man met his gaze. "Says Las Vegas." That night Dean received a message, not a threat, not an apology. A request. Russo wanted to talk. Dean read it once, then folded the paper neatly. "No," he said simply. Jan watched him closely. "Is that wise?" Dean smiled faintly. Wisdom isn't always polite. The refusal rippled outward faster than the confrontation itself. The message was unmistakable. Dean Martin did not negotiate respect for his family. He enforced it. Russo tried once more, sending intermediaries, men who spoke carefully, respectfully, using words like misunderstanding and regret. Dean declined every attempt. Quietly, publicly, finally Russo sent one last message. An apology. Not loud, not emotional, but complete. It acknowledged the disrespect. It promised distance. It accepted boundaries. Dean read it, considered it. Then he responded with a single sentence. "As long as my family is left alone, so are you." Nothing more. No victory lap. No warning. No threat. That restraint did what violence never could. It ended the matter. From that point forward, something in Las Vegas subtly changed. People spoke of Dean differently, not just as an entertainer, not just as a legend, but as a man who had reminded the city what real power looked like. Power that protected, not prayed. Years later, when Diana would walk down the aisle, the guest list would read like a map of influence. Politicians, business leaders, artists, and even men who once ruled through fear. Vincent Russo would attend too. He would keep his distance. He would lower his eyes. And he would remember the night he learned that there are forces stronger than intimidation. All because one father refused to stay silent. Time did what it always does. It moved forward quietly, without ceremony, carrying the weight of that night into places no one could fully predict. Las Vegas continued to glow. Casinos continued to rise and fall. Names that once ruled rooms faded into whispers. But one lesson lingered, unwritten, unspoken, yet universally understood. Some boundaries, once drawn, never disappear. Years passed. The sands changed ownership. New performers replaced old headliners. Neon signs were redesigned. The city reinvented itself again and again, as it always had. Yet among those who had been there, those who had felt the air shift in that room, there was an unshakable memory. Not of confrontation, not of threat, but of restraint. Dean Martin never spoke publicly about that night. He didn't retell the story on talk shows. He didn't reference it in interviews. When asked indirectly about influence or power, he redirected the conversation toward music, toward family, toward gratitude. That silence mattered. Because silence, when chosen, becomes authority. Diana grew into herself the way her father had hoped she would, not hardened, not fearful, but aware. She pursued her studies abroad, walked through museums where history spoke softly through stone and canvas. She learned that true preservation was not about guarding objects, but about honoring values. Whenever she faced moments of doubt, she remembered her father standing calmly between danger and dignity. Not angry, not reckless, just immovable. That memory became her compass. Dean, for his part, aged with grace. Fame softened into respect. Applause became secondary to presence. Those who knew him best understood that his greatest performances had never happened on stage. They had happened when no spotlight was willing. Vincent Russo's world shrank slowly. Not dramatically. Not violently. Just steadily. Fear stopped working the way it used to. People complied less eagerly. Meetings required more persuasion. Influence thinned where respect had never existed. Russo adapted, kept quieter, stayed within lines he once erased without thought. He never crossed Dean's family again. Not once. At Diana's wedding, the guest list read like a ledger of influence shaped by decades of goodwill. People came not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Laughter replaced whispers. Joy replaced calculation. Russo attended briefly. He stood at a distance, dressed plainly, respectful, almost invisible. When Dean's eyes met his across the room, Russo nodded, once. Dean returned the nod. No words were needed. That exchange said everything. Because power that must announce itself is already weakening. Power that protects others doesn't need explanation. Long after both men were gone, the story would survive, not as gossip, not as legend inflated by time, but as something quieter. Parents told it to children. Industry veterans told it to newcomers. It became a reference point, a reminder. That night in Las Vegas taught the city something it never forgot. Fear can control a room, but character controls a city. Dean Martin's true legacy wasn't just music or fame. It was the proof that kindness backed by conviction can stand firm against intimidation and win without destroying. And that when a father chooses to protect what is sacred, even the darkest figures learn where the line truly is. Some power fades when challenged. Others endure because they never needed fear to begin with.